It began like any other quiet summer night in suburban Minnesota. On June 14, 2025, the streets of Champlin and Brooklyn Park were still, lit only by porch lights and the occasional passing car. But beneath the calm, a sinister plan was already in motion. Around 2:00 a.m., a man wearing a full police uniform, body armor, and a disturbingly realistic latex mask approached the home of State Senator John Hoffman. He knocked authoritatively. "Police, open the door," he shouted, but something was off. Hoffman and his wife, Yvette, hesitated. As fear gripped them, the man corrected himself. "This is a robbery." In an instant, bullets flew. The man opened fire, shooting Senator Hoffman 9 times. Yvette 8. He left them for dead and vanished into the night. But this was only the beginning. The second strike. Barely an hour later, 15 miles away in Brooklyn Park, the same attacker struck again. This time, the victims were former Speaker of the Minnesota House, Melissa Hortman, and her husband, Mark. As with the Hoffmans, the killer arrived disguised as law enforcement. He knocked, waited, and when the door opened, unleashed a hail of gunfire. Melissa and Mark were killed instantly. Their family dog was also fatally shot. And just as quickly as he had appeared, the gunman disappeared. The news spread like wildfire. 2 respected public figures had been ambushed in their own home, with law enforcement baffled by the calculated precision of the attacks. Minnesota had not seen violence of this kind, not at this level, not with this intent. Who was behind the mask? Minnesota law enforcement launched the largest manhunt in state history. The assailant, later identified as 57-year-old Vance Leatherbolter, had used every tool of deception: a modified police SUV, false credentials, tactical gear, even face-covering prosthetics. But what was most terrifying wasn't his disguise, it was his motive. In Bolter's abandoned vehicle, investigators found a chilling manifesto and a list of over 30 political targets. Each was a Democratic lawmaker. Notes scrawled in the margins hinted at a crusade against those he believed were destroying the country. His actions, the FBI later concluded, were politically motivated. Bolter had access to sophisticated tracking tools. He used publicly available data and purchased private information from data brokers to locate the home addresses of Minnesota's lawmakers. What he assembled was more than a hit list. It was a detailed map of political retribution. The victims. Melissa Hortman was no stranger to the political arena. A lawyer by training, she had served in the Minnesota House for over 20 years, most recently as Speaker. Known for her progressive policies and sharp leadership, she had a reputation for getting things done and making enemies doing it. Her work focused on transportation reform, climate legislation, and expanding access to health care. She was widely respected, even among political opponents, for her intellect and resolve. Her death was not just a personal tragedy, it was a loss for the entire state. Her husband, Mark, was a quieter figure, often seen at events supporting her, rarely in the spotlight, but always at her side. The couple had been married for over 3 decades. Friends described them as inseparable. John Hoffman, still clinging to life after the attack, had served in the state Senate since 2012. He and Yvette were rushed to the hospital, undergoing multiple surgeries. Their survival was called a miracle. Hoffman was known for his advocacy on disability rights, and his constituents saw him as a compassionate and determined leader. A calculated hunt. Bolter hadn't stopped with just 2 homes. Authorities later discovered he had visited at least 2 more legislators' residences that night. Representative Kristen Bonner's home was next on his route, but she wasn't there. Another planned target, Senator Ann Rest, had narrowly escaped the same fate. This wasn't a random spree. It was a coordinated assassination attempt. Bolter had mapped out locations, stalked his victims, and planned his escape. Surveillance footage showed him in disguise at gas stations and fast food stops. He had prepared for weeks. He studied his targets' routines, learning when they were likely to be home, and he chose to strike when they were most vulnerable, in the quiet hours of the early morning. His movements were cold and methodical, indicating not just rage, but a chilling patience. Capture in the swamp. 2 days after the killings, Bolter was found hiding in a swampy area near Green Isle, Minnesota, 50 miles from the crime scenes. He was muddy, disoriented, and still dressed in tactical gear. A farmer had spotted him sneaking through fields. Bolter surrendered without a fight. In his possession were more notes, a GPS tracker, and a fake badge. He told federal agents, chillingly, that he was only halfway through his list. The manhunt had involved over 500 law enforcement officers, dozens of SWAT teams, drones, helicopters, and canine units. Entire neighborhoods were on lockdown. Residents were told to shelter in place, and when the announcement came that he was captured, there was a collective sigh of relief. A state in mourning. The news of Hortman's death and Hoffman's injuries hit Minnesota hard. Governor Tim Walz called it an attack on our democracy. Lawmakers from both parties stood united in grief. Vigils were held across the state. Thousands lined the streets for the Hortman's funeral procession. For the first time in state history, a woman, Melissa Hortman, lay in state at the Minnesota Capitol. Her husband was honored alongside her. Their dog, too, was given a memorial. The crowd of mourners stretched around the building. School children left drawings. Veterans saluted. Activists carried candles and flowers. In their shared sorrow, Minnesotans found solidarity. Across party lines, people mourned together, not just for the loss of life, but for what the violence represented. The aftermath. In the weeks that followed, Bolter was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, 2 counts of attempted murder, and a slew of federal offenses, including stalking elected officials and using false identification. Federal prosecutors have hinted at pursuing the death penalty. Investigators also uncovered that Bolter had accessed online data brokers to locate the addresses of his targets. This revelation sparked outrage and calls for reform. Lawmakers began pushing for stricter regulations on personal data, especially for public figures. Privacy advocates pointed out that the digital age had created vulnerabilities never before imagined. One senator said, "If you can buy a politician's home address for a few dollars online, how can we say we're protecting our democracy?" The deeper impact. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a wake-up call. Political violence in America had escalated from threats and rhetoric to doorstep assassinations. The symbolism was stark. Trusted public servants murdered in their own homes by a man claiming to uphold the law. The attacks reignited debates about political extremism, the safety of elected officials, and the ease with which someone can impersonate police. More legislators are now requesting personal security. Others are questioning how much longer they can serve without putting their families at risk. Capitol security protocols were immediately reviewed. Trainings were held for legislators on emergency response. Panic buttons were installed in homes. It was no longer a question of if, but when the next threat might come. A nation reacts. National figures weighed in. President Joe Biden condemned the attacks as abhorrent and cowardly. Former President Donald Trump called them un-American. Political rivals stood side by side in press conferences. For a brief moment, the divisions in American politics were eclipsed by a shared horror. Civil rights activists pointed to the growing normalization of violent rhetoric. "We are reaping what we've sown," one commentator said. "When violence is treated as a solution, this is what it looks like." The press explored Bolter's online activity, uncovering a history of conspiracy theories, extremist forums, and calls for violent revolution. He had posted in coded language, often referencing the idea of a cleansing or reset of American politics. The families left behind. For the Hortmans, a legacy ended too soon. Their children now carry the weight of their parents' memories. Friends speak of Melissa's laugh, Mark's quiet strength, their shared love of biking, and their Sunday morning pancake rituals. For the Hoffmans, life is changed forever. John faces a long recovery. Yvette has undergone multiple surgeries, but both have vowed to continue serving the people of Minnesota. "We were targeted because we care," Senator Hoffman said, "and we're not going to stop caring." A story that must be told. Melissa and Mark Hortman weren't just public figures. They were parents, neighbors, Minnesotans who believed in public service. John and Yvette Hoffman were community leaders who nearly lost their lives to hatred disguised as justice. Their stories must not be forgotten. In a time of division, this tragedy forced unity. Flags flew at half-staff. Crowds from across the political spectrum came together in grief. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the very principles of democracy, discourse, representation, and safety were reaffirmed. Bolter may have intended to silence voices. Instead, he amplified them. The investigation continues. Legal proceedings are set to unfold over the coming year. But the story is already being written in the hearts of Minnesotans. It's a story of pain, yes, but also one of resilience, remembrance, and resolve. And in that story, the names Melissa and Mark Hortman, John and Yvette Hoffman will live on, not just as victims, but as symbols of everything that must be protected when democracy is under attack. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you or made you reflect on the state of our democracy, please consider giving this video a like. It helps more people discover these important stories. And if you want to stay informed on true crime, political events, and the human stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. See you next time.